Good morning. It's a pleasure to welcome you here, to those who are in person and those who are online. Welcome to this wonderful event. My name is Lara Smith, and I'm the director of the African Studies program here at Georgetown University. I'm delighted to welcome you to this event. We particularly had been hoping for quite a while to have an in-person and hybrid event to welcome both those who are online as well as to welcome people to our campus, and to have the opportunity to be in person. So thank you so much for coming here on a Friday morning, bright and early, to join us for this important topic. And thank you particularly to our speakers for coming to share their knowledge and experience with us. I think we can all agree that this topic today that we'll be discussing is really one of the most important and relatively neglected set of topics in the Africa-China portfolio, looking at arts, culture, and the media. These sectors construct and also influence outcomes of great significance. And so we're really excited to be talking about it today, helping to delineate the boundaries of engagements and nature of relationships between particular countries and communities across these trans-regional partnerships. Cultural interventions are ubiquitous and meaning-filled, and we benefit deeply from the time spent unpacking how these engagements have both historically shaped Africa-China relations and how they continue to do so, and particularly looking at specific instances and cases. Of course, we sometimes call these soft power, but I think that there's so much more than that, right? These are really expressions of our common humanity, the ways that we build bridges across divides that could potentially be vast divides, linguistic and historical, as well as political and economic. By using the arts, the media, and cultural engagements to build these connections, we see each other as much more than strategic partners, but also as fellow humans. So for many citizens of African countries, these opportunities for new cultural, artistic engagements have and will continue to change how they perceive other interventions and projects and how these interactions and relationships evolve. So we really look forward to the conversations today throughout the multiple panels that you can see here and that my colleague will discuss in just a moment. And we look forward to the questions from the audience, both the in-person and the online audience later in the morning. I want to point out that this symposium is hosted by a number of partners at Georgetown, and I want to thank them. Certainly the African Studies program, which is honored to be able to be the kind of primary home for this important initiative, but also the initiative on U.S.-China dialogue on global issues, as well as the Asian Studies program in the Walsh School of Foreign Service. We really warmly thank all of the partners for their support of this event. And again, I want to thank our speakers for traveling here to be with us today. And I particularly want to thank my colleague, Professor Park, who has helped us to really think about what are the themes we need to focus on and then gathered all these speakers here today. So I'll turn it over to Professor Park, who will introduce our speakers and more of the focus of today's theme.
Morning, everybody. Thank you again for being here. For those of you who are in the audience, there are refreshments right outside the back door, and the restrooms are just behind that back wall, although you all look like you're from here. So, and I want to thank our virtual audience who's joining us via Zoom webinar. I understand we're having some problems with the Zoom webinar. If we do, please understand that the whole event is being filmed, so you and others who aren't able to be here today would be able to get access to the entire event at a later time. I also want to add a word of thanks to people without whom this event could not have taken place. Professor Smith thanked the kind of institutions. I want to thank the individual people. Eleanor Alberts has been with me kind of through the conceptualization and the whole invitation process from the initiative for U.S.-China dialogue on global issues. That's part of Georgetown. She is a pre-doctoral fellow there. And at African Studies, our newest member of the team, Riley Anderson, who joins us virtually, is our new events and communications coordinator, and this was kind of a new job and learning kind of under fire. This is her second week on the job, so I really thanks to her. We have two student assistants with us, Wadad Osman and Julio Wong, sorry, Julio, and Marta Manzano from Our African Studies has been critical to also getting this done and getting all the bookings and everything. This is our first hybrid event, the first in-person event that the Africa-China Initiative has undertaken. So thank you again for being here. Hopefully next time we'll get bigger audiences and have a little bit more lead time for things, but we really appreciate you coming out on this beautiful Friday morning. So I'm going to introduce our speakers and then just give a couple kind of housekeeping rules. We're still waiting for one of our speakers to arrive. The original program had 2 separate panels, and we unfortunately lost one of our speakers. Ignacio Suglo was having a health emergency, and he was unable to come down from Philadelphia this morning. So unfortunately, we won't have the benefit of his really interesting research. So we reorganized the day a little bit. You can see on the screen. And because Emeka is currently fighting with DC traffic, we're going to change the order a little bit. We'll start with Maria Repnikova. Maria is currently Associate Professor at Georgia State University. She is a scholar of global communications with a comparative focus on China and Russia. Her research examines the processes of political resistance and persuasion in illiberal political contexts, drawing on ethnographic research approaches and extensive time in the field. Most recently, she's been researching and completing a monograph on Chinese soft power in Africa with a focus on Ethiopia. So while we wait for Emeka, actually Maria is going to start us off with the Chinese state media framing and local reactions to Chinese media. Hopefully by then, Emeka Umeji will join us. He is currently a fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy. Emeka is a media scholar whose research focuses on Chinese media and digital infrastructure in Africa. He has taught at institutions across the continent, and prior to entering academia, he served as an investigative journalist for several years. During his current fellowship, Dr. Umeji has been analyzing the impact of the Belt and Road News Network as a vehicle for the influence operation of the Chinese party state over African media development. And our last speaker is Vivian Liu. Vivian is assistant professor at Fordham University. She is a cultural anthropologist whose work focuses on capitalism, ethno-racialization, and diasporic mobilizations. Her first book project focuses on the politics of commercial profit amongst the extensive migratory circulations of Nigerian businessmen across contemporary trade sites in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Her presentation today, which focuses on the persistent ninja, looks at Chinese aesthetic, mystique, and masculinity in Nigerian media, and is happy kind of product of COVID lockdown when she couldn't go and do field research. So we are very fortunate that she was stuck at home because this is a really, really interesting presentation. One final comment is that for our virtual audience, we're going to keep the morning presentations and do them one after another and just take 1 or 2 questions after each of those. So if you could hold your questions, we'll have an opportunity to have questions from both the in-person audience as well as the virtual audience after the roundtable discussion that will start around 11:30. So with that, I bring Maria.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Great. So thank you so much to you for inviting me. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here. I'm a graduate of Georgetown undergraduate program at the School of Foreign Service, so it's really nice to be back on campus as well, and this is a new building I couldn't find apparently. So I guess I forgot how things changed or haven't been back in a very long time, so it's great to be here and to be part of this important conversation. I'm very sad to hear that Ignatius couldn't make it. I've been excited to meet him for some time, and also Emeka was supposed to go first, and actually have been reading his work for a long time and assigned it to my whole class for the next coming week to read his book, so I really highly recommend his recent book on Chinese state media and the relations between Chinese and African journalists in Kenya. It's a really interesting volume that just came out. So since I'm starting first, I will do my best to kind of give maybe a bit of a broader picture of Chinese state media engagements, but also I will zoom in on my case of Ethiopia, where I've been doing field research, and that's where I'm really coming up with most of my findings and analyses. And this is part of a book project that I'm in the process of still writing and rethinking. So I'm going to share a bit of the framing that I'm currently thinking about in my book, but delving into specifically the media context. And I'll really welcome any feedback, thoughts, critiques on how this sounds to you. And as I'm changing it, and I'm getting back to the field in late April, so it'd be great to get new, fresh insights and then go back and try to tease them out in real time. So to start with, I wanted just to give a bit of a kind of step back and give a bit of a broader, kind of context in terms of how Chinese public diplomacy has been shifting in Africa. And I know that Laura mentioned that soft power, of course, is not the only prism to look at it. So in my work, I kind of try to critically examine this idea of soft power, to deconstruct it to the level of people-to-people engagements and perceptions, as opposed to just kind of the state project and only top-down initiatives. So hopefully this kind of comes through as we discuss this topic. But just very briefly, in terms of what Chinese party-state has been doing over the past 2 decades or so, but especially in the past maybe 10 years, there's several instruments or initiatives that I think are really important to examine when it comes to state-sponsored public diplomacy. So this is not just kind of bottom-up, people-to-people, but more so kind of sponsored by the party state. We have official trainings, elite trainings, so elites from all various ministries, political parties, as well as the media coming for trainings in exchanges to China. And these trainings are really quite large in terms of numbers. They used to be even bigger. So in 2018, there were 50,000 new trainings pledged. It's a really enormous number in comparison to other countries and what they're offering to elites from Africa. And then in the recent FOCAC meeting, it was 10,000, which is still a pretty large scale offering. When it comes to journalists, there are about 1,000 a year that come from African countries for trainings. But this typically, I think, focuses on long-term trainings as opposed to short-term. There are also short-term visits that are about 2 to 3 weeks long that are really a bit ad hoc and hard to measure in terms of numbers. But really, it's a really vibrant space in terms of the trainings and exchanges, and I'm going to tap into that in a moment to talk about the journalists' perspectives on this. And then the second one is Confucius Institutes, right? We have this Chinese language culture trainings across Africa, and of course, these institutes have been very controversial in the United States and Canada and Europe. They've been mostly shut down for ideological reasons, but in Africa, they're actually quite vibrant, and that's something I write about in my other work, that they often tie Chinese language and culture training to job opportunities at Chinese companies, and they don't seem to be in question in terms of being closed down. I mean, there are, of course, critiques and also some forms of suspicion, but not quite to the extent of what we're seeing here in the US. And lastly, of course, the media is a really important channel. And here I'm thinking about state media expansion into Africa. And I think when it comes to China's soft power at large, or the way the Chinese government brands its image, media has been the first instrument that they really invested in when it comes to going outwards and expanding what China is all about. So starting in the 90s already, Chinese state media was expanding its wings to other regions, and Africa has been a really important also testing ground for Chinese state media, with the main hubs being based in Nairobi, but the media itself expanding across many countries. So in my analyses, which really draws on qualitative research in the context of Ethiopia primarily, but I try to expand a little bit to other participants when it comes to trainings, for instance, from other African countries. When my last trip to Beijing was 2019, pre-pandemic, so I've been following up over email, but of course there's been a gap that I'm trying to hopefully fill before I finish the project. But this analysis drawing on kind of all three of these instruments is in my book project that I'm analyzing. It emphasizes the notion of pragmatic appeal in Chinese public diplomacy initiatives. So the idea of focusing on pragmatic or material incentives or tangible wins for the other side in promoting Chinese culture through the state-sponsored initiatives. And specifically, this takes place at kind of three different levels, the way that I see it. On the one hand, we have high-level rhetoric, diplomatic rhetoric coming from Chinese leaders, diplomats, that often emphasize the idea of generosity or kind of giving or gifting as part of Chinese public diplomacy engagements. And we don't only see that in the context of Africa, but also global South at large, and even just the world. If you look at Xi Jinping's speeches and compare it to, for instance, President Biden's speeches, it's a very different focus. Biden focuses on ideological competition between democracies and autocracies, and Xi focuses on the idea of materially empowering other countries through this notion of mutuality, gifting, and aiding. But then when you look at the actual practical application of these ideas, we see this taking place on two levels. One is the inclusivity of Chinese initiatives, something I describe as the appeal of scale. Chinese diplomatic and media offerings are easily accessible across the board, much more accessible than anything coming from Europe or the US. So we see this accessibility feature. And then there's the fusion of material and culture when it comes to how China presents its image through these initiatives. And I'm going to highlight how that works in the context of the media. And as I mentioned in my case, in my research, I focus on Ethiopian context, and I think it's a really interesting case study for thinking about China's engagement in its promotion of its image and how the response to these engagements takes place on the ground, because it's really fascinating, very multifaceted relationship that has been described as a model relationship for China-Africa relations and also South-South relations as well. There's this idea that one could kind of model other relations based on what's happening in Ethiopia, and it's been a very close engagement on multiple levels. On the economic level, Ethiopia is the second largest recipient of loans coming from the Chinese enterprises, Chinese government. There are also about 700 Chinese companies operating in Ethiopia. This might have changed somewhat during pandemic, something I'm hoping again to follow up on, but it's a really large number of companies. Many of them are private. And then you just kind of feel the presence of China across the major cities, major urban, spaces where there are signs and signals that Chinese construction is really everywhere. There's a small Chinatown. There's kind of a sense that China is very much an intricate part of this country. Something you hear from anybody from elites to urban dwellers to lay citizens. Everyone brings up China in some capacity as soon as you ask about it or introduce your research. And of course, there are also very close ties between the two political parties. The main political party in Ethiopia, it used to be called EPRDF, now it's Prosperity Party, has been very closely tied to CCP. And even during the civil war, the ongoing conflict that's now, hopefully, waning away, but still it's a very sensitive situation. Chinese government has stayed put and has continued to collaborate with those in power. So it hasn't really shifted gears like the US government that's, was critical of what's going on the ground. Chinese government has stayed very much in place and engaged. And of course, Ethiopia is also the hub to the African Union. So there's a lot of emphasis on Ethiopia as kind of a gateway to reach other countries in the region. So the way that I see Chinese state media outreach initiatives when it comes to Ethiopia, but also more broadly, are on kind of two levels or in two folds. One is shaping public opinion on the ground through Chinese state media, coverage and initiatives. And the second is targeted persuasion of local media elites through trainings that I already mentioned and exchanges that take place in China. So these are at least, two levels, but of course there are many other also non-state engagements. So this is not by any means all-inclusive. This is just two ideas that I'm currently playing with or analyzing. So I wanted to introduce to you kind of how this notion of pragmatic enticement works when it comes to both of these initiatives, the state media expansion and the idea of engaging through elite trainings, so targeted persuasion of journalists. So when it comes to Chinese state media initiatives, I see it as on the one hand, being focused on access, so that what I describe it as kind of overflooding the market, both in physical and digital domains. So when it comes to physical domain, for instance, you see China Daily is the only foreign or international newspaper that's being delivered for free across many public spaces. Of course, the question is whether or not it's being read, and I'm going to get to the reception part later on and argue that actually it's not really being, paid much attention to, but nonetheless, it occupies physical space in international hotels, but also in interesting spaces like the universities. I was analyzing Confucius Institutes, and I found out that volunteers are tasked with delivering the paper to many high-level offices within the university. So it was interesting how part of their work was literally physically taking the paper and sharing that paper across different offices. And the same thing also goes for state media. It was delivered, also inserted as an insert into one of the major newspapers. I think that actually has now changed, that they're no longer inserting the paper, but it was the case for a number of years that they would insert part of China Daily into a local paper. And that's kind of delegation of persuasion works across other contexts as well. We see Chinese state media is really trying to kind of be more subtle about how it promotes its messaging as opposed to just covering certain stories into delivering its own product. It also inserts its media directly into other spaces. When it comes to digital access, Xinhua News Agency provides access to its database of stories. So it's kind of akin to AP or Reuters, providing access for free to its basically large-scale international database of stories. It's not always useful to all the journalists, and again, I'll get to that later, but nonetheless, it provides a lot of coverage of China-Africa issues and just global issues at large for free. So that's something that is also, materially, potentially useful to some editors, especially working for state media that might tap into that. When it comes to narratives that are being projected through the state media and what kind of stories are they really telling, from the perspective of journalists that I've interviewed on the Chinese side, the producers, there was a lot of rhetoric that taps into this notion of uplifting, right? Ethiopia in this case, improving its stature, and especially in economic sense. This particular editor was really interesting in how he talked about positive stories about Ethiopia in turn attracting investors to Ethiopia. So he had a very kind of tactical vision that if it's perceived more positively, more investors will come. So I asked if he has seen any examples of that. He actually brought up Russia and said that he heard from his collaborators that in Russia, officials are reading about Ethiopia and Africa at large from Xinhua. So they're consuming information from Xinhua. I don't know if that's really true. I would have to find out more from Russian interviewees, but that's something that he claimed and he felt quite proud of, that there is this information channeling outwards and attracting more readers to Ethiopia. And this idea of uplifting, it also very much speaks to the tradition within China, domestic tradition of constructive journalism that I've analyzed in my previous work. This notion of focusing on solutions, on positive angles, and even if one presents a certain critique, you have to have kind of a conclusion that's a little bit more positive. That's something that's not seen necessarily as a bad thing, within China, because Chinese journalists are highly constrained, they're very censored. So for them to be able to provide any kind of critical remarks, they have to have a more solutions-oriented sort of coverage or framing. In the case of Africa, though, I think there is very little critical remarks or very little critique that comes through this media coverage. It seems to be primarily positive. And the narratives really focus on China as an agent of economic empowerment for Ethiopia. So it's not so much just, positive stories about Ethiopia, but more so about China as being a positive actor in Ethiopia. And you see a lot of narratives that, focus on Chinese actors themselves, who are based in Ethiopia. So they're engineers, workers, all kinds of individuals who are making a difference. And a lot of the stories really emphasize that angle in China Daily, African Weekly, which is what I've analyzed. But similar findings have been also uncovered in other analyses by other scholars who focus on state media initiatives, that China is kind of prioritized in this so-called constructive or positive reporting of Africa, and less so Africa itself. So you see kind of narratives or quotes like this that are a little bit emotional. They're trying to create sort of an affective bond with the audience. This is from an engineer, a quote from an engineer who's working in Adama, and he's constructing, or used to be constructing, Addis Djibouti Railway. So he talks about how the difficulties are nothing compared with the benefits Ethiopians are going to enjoy as a result of the project. So really emphasizing how the sacrifice is worth it. Of course, this is just a very limited quote, but a lot of the stories I've looked at just really delve into these sacrificial ideas, so notions of how much Chinese people are really giving away, whether it's contact with their families, their parents back home, sometimes they're separated from their children, they're from their husbands and wives, sometimes they can't access networks to actually contact them, sometimes they're eating the food they're not used to. So all kinds of really, illustrative and quite touching stories about these individuals, but really much less so about the Ethiopian perspective. When Ethiopians are brought up, it's more so on the receiving side, that they're kind of affirming this narrative that they're benefiting. They're either being presented as employees of Chinese companies or as collaborators or as a general kind of public that's very happy about what China is constructing or doing in the country. So it's more of a passive kind of framing of what the audience or what Ethiopia is actually engaging with when it comes to China. I want to shift now to elite trainings as the second mechanism when it comes to engagement, and I'm happy to expand on any of those points as well during the Q&A period. So when it comes to trainings, I already mentioned how there's large-scale, short-term and long-term experiences that are being provided to participants from many African countries. In the case of Ethiopia, I found that these trainings are talked about very much through the lens of accessibility. When I interviewed journalists and editors from across state media, but also private media outlets in Addis Ababa, a lot of them talked about either willing to go to China or have heard of someone going to China, or they have already gone. So there's kind of that sense of proximity, right, when it comes to China. So how does one get there? I think one of the first steps, or the main step, is really being nominated by one's own agency where you work. So your boss within the news agency would have to pick an individual, sometimes two, for a particular fellowship to nominate for this experience. And then once you get to that nomination, getting the visa is actually quite a straightforward process from what I've heard. It's not very, labor intensive, and the application itself is quite brief. So there isn't like a long essay or a lot of, social educational capital that goes into kind of really just working on that application the way that it usually is the case for trainings and exchanges in the media space in the United States. They take up a lot of time to apply for. So this notion of inclusivity, I think, is really critical because that is often the only option when it comes to exchanges and trainings. But then when it comes to going to China, it seems to be less about teaching particular aspects of journalistic governance or media, work or professional skills, but more so about presenting China, right? Showing off China as an economic miracle and as a generous ally. So in Washington in particular, which is where we are currently based, there's a lot of talk of China exporting its authoritarian model, and there's also discussions of potentially China is teaching, right, Chinese government teaching censorship techniques and propaganda techniques to other countries. At least from my more narrow angle of this particular study, I haven't found empirical evidence of specific exposure to those skills of censorship or propaganda targeted at journalists. So maybe those who are buying technology, surveillance technology, are taught how to use it. That seems to be quite sensible, and I think that does take place. But journalists themselves are kind of taking on this grand tour of China, and it's an exciting experience for some, maybe less so for others, but less so of a kind of a direct targeted teaching of here's how we do our media work. In fact, if anything, Chinese officials and scholars tend to underplay the ideas of censorship or propaganda that are very much prominent in the Chinese media space. They kind of underplay them and instead focus on issues like digital governance when it comes to media. For instance, journalistic sector going digital. They would highlight how Chinese state media is surviving journalism crises and they're making money. So a lot of kind of focus on success stories, but less so in terms of, controlling public opinion, more so kind of engaging and serving positive societal functions within within China. The one kind of maybe example of more ideological leaning that I found in some of the trainings that I've attended was the focus on how Chinese state media in general, its framing and its mode of journalism is just better in terms of its values, the values it promotes, than the Western media. So there was a direct comparison made by one Chinese scholar between, again, the constructive journalism that China is promoting, which is focused on solutions, hopefulness, positive stories, uplifting other countries and people, and the more negative, crisis-oriented journalism that's presented in Western media. So that comparison was quite vivid, and I think that resonated with many participants. But that was as far, in terms of the kind of comparative ideological dimension that I found in my research. But maybe in other cases it's different. So I don't claim that this represents everything at large in that space. So when it comes to these trainings, right, the focus is primarily on the economic miracle sort of stories, success stories, and specifically when it comes to rural governance. A lot of journalists are taken to rural areas where China has claimed that it has beat poverty, right? It has lifted up or out 700 million people out of poverty. That's the statistic that's really, widely talked about and stressed by the trainers themselves, and that's something that comes through a lot of these experiences. But it's not simply statistical; it also really speaks to the experiences of some of these trainers themselves, who I've also interviewed for the study, who really talk about how they themselves have seen in their lifetime China transform from them and their families being extremely poor to being relatively well off. And that's something that brings them quite a bit of emotion to talk about. That's something that they've experienced, their parents have experienced, and that's something that they share with a lot of, first of all, confidence, but also personal stories. I think that really does resonate. It's not just numbers, it's not just kind of big data points, which is also part of these trainings, but also personal individualistic stories that, again, kind of creates, to quote Laura, some degree of humanity or connection and bond between participants and the trainers. So I think that's a really important element there. And then all of this is also very much taking place in the context of China as being presented as a generous ally, right? So these journalists are treated at the highest level. They're housed in 5-star hotels. They're taken to all kinds of banquets, courtship rituals. On the way home to their home countries, they're also going for shopping at the local markets at the courtesy of Chinese government that gives, pockets of money to buy gifts. So everything is really meticulously organized and taken care of. But of course, meticulous organization also means there are many areas one cannot see or should not experience as part of this trip. So you cannot wander around by yourself too much or experience things in an ad hoc, spontaneous basis, the way that you would actually if you come to the US or Europe. But in the Chinese case, it's really organized from the morning to very late night, and everything is taken care of for you. So it creates kind of a constraint, but also very interesting, intense experience for the participants. So I wanted to shift for the remaining of my time to talk a little bit about reception to these initiatives and just how Chinese state media is being perceived from different angles, including these experiences, the trainings, and state media coverage. So this is something that I'm trying to construct and argue in the larger book project as well, is that it's very difficult to measure and to equivocally talk about reception. I think that's something that in IR scholarship or in other, I guess mostly IR, the fields that focus specifically on soft power, they would say, well, how do we measure it? Mostly public opinion polls. So we look at Afrobarometer, and it says that people like China, they're favorable towards China. So that means there's a good relationship that Chinese soft power is working. So I'm a little bit critical of that perspective, just because I think that if you do on-the-ground research, you just don't get that equivocal state feeling or sentiment. It's really a mix of sentiments that are coexisting together. It's a very contradictory picture. And I think that's not only when it comes to China, it's also any major power that's involved in another regional context will be perceived with some degree of contradictions. The United States is the same thing, right? If you ask people about the United States, you'll have some degree of aspiration, respect, and maybe a sense of engagement, but also a lot of resentment and cynicism. So I think that maybe speaks to other powers, not only China. But I think it's important to note here that depends on the methods you're using, you might come up with a different idea of what reception looks like. So in my case, I found that there is a mix of limited, when it comes to the media, opportunistic engagement with what China is offering, but also sentiments of alienation that are also produced through these soft power initiatives. So when it comes to limited engagement, the first thing I wanted to note is that engagement overall with Chinese state media is quite constrained or sort of limited to certain groups and audiences. So first of all, when it comes to just general awareness of what state media is, what is Chinese state media, what are the names of major outlets, what is it doing on the ground, and I did a lot of these questionnaires or kind of engagements through trainings that I carried out myself with different groups and students, elites, and others, where we talk about China in a room like this, full of different individuals, and they would ask questions and I would ask them questions. So I would often ask, have you heard of CGTN or Xinhua News or China Daily? And within a room like this, maybe 5 or 6 people would raise their hand. But it really wasn't a whole lot of awareness. And these are individuals who are actually really actively engaged in international relations or in some form of kind of context of learning about China indirectly. And yet they had no idea what Chinese state media was even doing, or even the names didn't ring the bell to them. So I thought that was interesting that it's not a household name, right? People don't know CGTN or Xinhua or China Daily is a household name. And when it comes to who is actually consuming this kind of media, I think it's mostly very specific groups of elites. So for example, state media journalists who are using Xinhua News database or who are writing about China-Africa relations might be at times invoking those stories, copying them, mimicking them, and they might be much more paying attention much more closely to what these stories are representing. Or diplomats or officials who are actually following China, they might be interested in what Chinese official stance is on certain issues. So it's very much limited to those specific groups. And when it comes to trainings as well, they target and attract state media employees. They primarily focus in the context of Ethiopia on state media, which is kind of the main sector, so it is not a small thing, but they don't really focus on private media or non-official, non-kind of state initiatives. And there are many groups and initiatives that are made up of all kinds of commentators, public intellectuals, activists that are really much more popular on social media than the state media, but they're never really targeted by Chinese initiatives when it comes to trainings. So they're kind of targeting and getting a certain slice of the population, but not quite the other slices, right? The non-official private media are not part of this group. And it's really the opposite of what I think the US has been doing, is really focusing more on private and critical voices. And at the time when I was doing my research, I was also speaking to US embassy people on the ground, and they said maybe we should shift towards being more inclusive to include state media, because some of them are actually quite critical and interesting thinkers and individuals who might be able to get somewhere through this kind of engagement. But I think it looks a bit sensitive from the US government perspective to train state media, because it sounds like they're associated with propaganda, with the regime, and then you're training them. It's a kind of a questionable endeavor based on funding. But so it's kind of an interesting division of labor here, where China is training state media and US is training private media actors. But overall, just the point I wanted to make here is this is limited engagement, right? It's something we should have to think about in terms of Chinese media influence at large. And recently there was a big study published about, actually, I think CGTN's influence through an experimental study across 19 countries. And they found that this messaging really invokes positive engagements or feelings about China. But the interesting thing is that many people don't engage in the first place. So an experiment kind of positions you in a place where you have to engage because you're in an experimental setting, right? It's kind of like a scientific experiment. So you have to engage. So maybe if they do engage, they might shift their perspectives, but I think that many people just don't engage, or they see it as a mix of, maybe sometimes boring content or just invisible content. So it's not always, as readily accessible to them, or they don't desire to consume it. And then those that do engage with it, I see this engage as very much opportunistic or kind of tactical in terms of what they're getting out of these initiatives. So tactical on several levels when it comes to Chinese state media. As I mentioned, there is this utility when it comes to free, databases of content, and also in some ways also symbolic terms, and access to nation branding, right? The idea of positioning Ethiopia in a more positive light. At least the elites that I spoke to found this to be relatively positive development, that they could see kind of positive stories about Ethiopia appearing in global media, because Ethiopian media does not have access to global audiences. So China kind of, tags on Ethiopia with it and presents it in a positive way. That's something that they see as, as potentially lucrative, or at least a pleasant surprise, just to discover. So at the very least, there's some, positive associations with it. And when it comes to elite trainings and exchanges, as I already noted, that there is not a whole lot of, specific teachings of skills, but more so showing off, showcasing China's success stories. So the way that it's often received is a form of leisure, right? An exposure to, quote, the global. So it was really interesting talking about these trainings with the interviewees, who sometimes would complain about, the lack of practical skills, or the fact that, they're going there, but they're not gaining something specific. And when I would ask them if they would still consider going again if they're invited, the response from one of these interviewees, who is an editor in Ethiopia, was, these trainings are a picnic, and why would I want to miss a picnic? He said. The idea of kind of something, it's fun, right? It's a leisure, it's a free trip. You get to also hang out with other Ethiopian journalists and other African journalists, so there's a sentiment of Pan-Africanism that also forms as part of these engagements, and oftentimes that's where they spend most of their kind of fun, leisurely time in the evenings, in the mornings with each other, and that's where I think the exciting part, comes through. So it definitely is seen as a kind of a mini vacation, and in fact, I've heard also of rumors that even some officials send their secretaries and friends to go on these trips instead of them, just to kind of go and have fun in China. I mean, that's a bit more of a rumor, but nonetheless, the rumors are also telling that there is something about this that's a little bit comical. And the exposure to the global, right? Exposure to a different context. China, of course, is a success story in the economic domain for many individuals who are considering these trainings. And in the words of another journalist I spoke to, it's better to see China than to stay at home and see nothing. So it's an interesting contrast, staying at home versus seeing China. So China is an exposure to something else, something global. And for many of them, it's also a transit point to other experiences. Many of these returnees, they then apply to fellowships in the West, and they see it as kind of an experience, but not a final experience. They still want to get elsewhere, which is also an interesting kind of dynamic in I think, China-Ethiopia relations. And then I think as part of these kind of engagements, the opportunistic engagements, it's worth noting also that what China gets back here in terms of, what it's actually gaining from these experiences on the official level are these strategic expressions of gratitude. So there's a lot of expressions of gratitude that are being, carried out through these initiatives, at least at the official level, and that I found to be really interesting to look at these kind of performances of solidarity. So for example, when it comes to journalists visiting China, one of their tasks that maybe they're not quite aware of until they go there is that they have to give interviews to a lot of local media, Chinese media. And I found this to be really fascinating, like attending the China-Africa Trade Fair in Hunan province in my last trip. There was so many local media outlets from all over Hunan province, not only just national ones, that are just constantly interviewing these journalists about their experiences in China. What do they think? What is their takeaway? And of course, they give mostly positive interviews, right? They really are very complimentary and kind of almost in glowing details about just how wonderful China is. So sometimes they even are more positive than their interviewers. I've observed some of these interviews where Chinese counterpart would be like, well, aren't you a little bit concerned about the loans? And the respondent would say, oh, that's just Western propaganda. So it's a really kind of really playing out the sentiment, which I thought was just a really interesting notion. And I also found that from students who are there in the long term, who are studying media kind of on a master's degree sort of basis, they're also giving lots of interviews to local media, to newspapers on campus, and just they're constantly being interviewed, which is really interesting idea. And I think it taps into this notion of legitimacy for the Chinese Communist Party that really speaks to this mix of external and internal legitimation, right? They want to prove to their own publics that China is doing something right, and it's a really good way to prove it by inviting foreign guests who will say that, indirectly, they will kind of say it to these public audiences instead of the Chinese government saying it, right? It's kind of they're replacing the government's rhetoric in much more passionate terms and oftentimes more convincing narratives. So I found that to be a really important part of what China is kind of gaining back, as maybe not so much of just liking China or engaging, but giving back through this kind of reciprocal performances of gratitude. And in terms of the content that's published in Ethiopian state media when it comes to China, it's also overwhelmingly positive, right? I analyzed 5-year period of content, just in the keywords China-Ethiopia relations, not a single in-depth or investigative report on what China is doing on the ground in state media. And journalists who do return from these trainings are often tasked with writing about their experiences in China, and they're also very, very positive. One just example or a vignette from an individual who works for state media who tried to publish something a little bit more critical. It was reflective. He really was trying to talk about how some of these trainings are taking them to spaces that maybe are not that useful, so they could maybe change their itinerary a little bit. He reached out to the Chinese ambassador, he reached out to several people, and he never got any response. It was just completely ignored. So I asked him, are you going to publish a story? He says, well, I can't get a quote from the Chinese ambassador, so I guess I'm just gonna let it go. So it's kind of that sense that, if you don't have the other side, you can't quote them, they don't respond, this critique doesn't really go anywhere. So even though he had a critical perspective, he didn't really end up publishing it. That was the only example I encountered of kind of an attempt to publish something more critical. And very micro scale, there are lots of surveys that Chinese counterparts are doing to understand how they're being perceived in terms of these programs and teachings. And the surveys are also about 100% positive. In fact, the trainers actually asked me what I think the perception is, because they don't get the response that they're more mixed response. They want to know what's not working, but the respondents don't give them that answer. They really again play up the positive perspective in public context or in surveys. And I know I have only a few minutes, so I wanted to just conclude on a couple of notes in terms of cynicism and alienation that also transpires through these soft power sort of encounters and engagements. So when it comes to this sentiments of cynicism, I think what Chinese state media engagements also show, or at least end up transpiring in, is this reflections, critical reflections on behalf of the participants about what China is about, what Chinese state media is about. And oftentimes these reflections are not always that positive when they talk about in private context, not publicly performing, but amongst themselves or in interviews, in focus groups. It's a very different response that comes through. So one of these critical perceptions is that associations of Chinese state media with propaganda, right, and selective coverage of China-Ethiopia relations. If you ask about the perspective of journalists on how Chinese state media is doing, it's usually that it's a mix of boring and kind of propagandistic pro-China content. So they're not convinced by this kind of journalism as in terms of its professional level or how it's really functioning. And this is also the case in education sector. So when it comes to education or training journalism students in universities, when I asked about constructive journalism in Chinese media as being an example, the response was really quite cynical. It's like, well, this is not professional, it's just propaganda, right? We're not going to learn from this perspective. This is not useful for us. So this is really kind of interesting how this presentation doesn't seem to transpire into deeper engagement or not necessarily trust even, but just deeper engagement or enthusiasm for this kind of genre, both in terms of teaching journalists, but also just consuming information at large with a degree of kind of distance to observe what's propaganda, what's not. And secondly, there's this notion of self-censorship that very much is reflected upon by the participants in how they engage with China, with Chinese counterparts through the mediums of writing, but also, when it comes to interviews. And especially with trainings, as they go on these trips, they quickly discover that there are many red lines that one, shouldn't cross and questions one shouldn't ask when it comes to China's engagement in Ethiopia and China's political system. But when it comes to Ethiopia engagements in particular, one really interesting example was an official who asked about the environmental impact of Chinese enterprises in Ethiopia, and the response he got was, "Are you coming from the United States?" So it was immediately kind of pushback that you're asking questions that are clearly an American talking point. So he actually pushed on. He said, "Well, I'm actually coming from Ethiopia, and I really want to know." So then there was kind of diversion and eventually silence on this topic. So this experience really shapes, I think, how what one takes away from these trainings. It's a mix of some opportunistic engagement, some inspiration for sure in what China has accomplished, and some maybe human bonds or connections are also being formed, but also a degree of distancing that we can't quite ask difficult questions. And without the difficult conversation, without arguing, without having any contested kind of space between them, it's very difficult to move forward and build deeper ties. So I think I'll actually stop there because I'm going a little bit over time. So I appreciate your attention, and I look forward to questions and hearing the next presenter.
Thank you for the talk. My question is about after people return to Ethiopia, do their career trajectory changes? So I'm asking, but is there selection, like people who goes to China get promoted afterwards?
Is there anything else? Okay, great. Thanks, Maria.
Thank you so much for the question. So when it comes to repeat trainees, I think if I understand correctly, it's like if you go over and over, does this change one's opinions or perceptions? It doesn't seem to. Yes, it's a big. I guess it's a bit of a mixed story. On the one hand, I think if those who go for longer periods, for instance, 1 or 2-year degree programs, they get to see more of China and more of its complexity. Right. Of course, anybody who stays for a long time there can see, mix of poverty and underdevelopment and extreme development and all kinds of critical boundaries and spaces that one shouldn't touch, but also the more humane connections that are formed amongst friends and students and faculty. So I think it becomes almost even a more mixed kind of rich picture as opposed to one completely shifting in kind of more positive or negative direction. I think when it comes to seeing just more critical perspectives on China's developmental trajectory, longer term stays seem to expose that to students. So they come back with, I think, a much more in-depth understanding and more questions about what China's rhetoric is saying, right? Because the rhetoric is really talking about China's development through two different forces. One is the CCP's governance and its kind of methodical approach to governance and efficiency, and the second is the work ethic of Chinese people. Those are the two things they stress in their trainings, which is also really interesting because, of course, Chinese development is part of so many different, it's empowered by so many different forces, including foreign direct investment and diaspora's, help and so forth. It's not just the people and the government, but that's what's being presented. And I think once people actually spend time there, they get a much more complex, nuanced perspective. They may not really, believe these narratives even less so than they did at the beginning. So to me, I think longer term actually maybe creates a more, more critical exposure, but at the same time also more personal connections that are formed. So it becomes a very complex, mixed, relationship with the country, which I guess speaks to the same themes I highlighted, but maybe in a more deeper level. So thank you for that question. I'll have to think about that a little bit more as well. And the second question, career trajectories. Going to China, does it change one's career trajectories? So it really depends. I think there is some notion of being promoted depending on what you're getting in terms of your degree. So if you're getting a master's degree or a PhD, there is definitely hope for promotion. So that's why you're kind of going there. You might get, a higher boost in your professional standing. If you're going for a 2-week trip or a short-term training, there's not much promotion with that. It's just a trip, right? So you might get some experience, but you're not going to get any kind of upward mobility from that. When I asked in the university sector in particular whether or not there is a promotion that comes from Chinese experiences that's different from like Western education degrees like masters or PhDs in Europe or Canada or the US, the response was still that the latter is valued more. So Western degrees seem to have a kind of a higher value in terms of getting promotion, getting certain jobs, and Chinese degrees are like a little bit lower down the line. So maybe that's going to equalize over time, but there's a lot of concern with quality of Chinese education. So even though it's provided at mass scale, the quality seems to be a concern in terms of what are they really getting out of the education. It depends on which school you go to. You might get a really great experience or not a very good experience. So that's a big issue in terms of also promotion. Do you have the skills to be promoted, or is it just the name, the brand, the title? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maria. For those of you in the our virtual audiences, please hold your questions for Maria. We'll be able to take them at the end of our morning. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Emeka Umeji. And he's going to speak to us about the Belton Road.
We're still in morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be here. Happy to see so many important people within this China-Africa space. Thank you, Yoon, for putting this together. Happy to see Maria Repnikova, who wrote a very inspiring and attractive. Was that snippet? I don't know, for my book when I was writing my book. Thank you, Maria. I'm grateful. Yeah. So today I'm going to present on Belt and Road News Network. Sometimes we have to wonder what is Belt and Road News Network. We know Belt and Road Initiative, right? But I think Belt and Road News Network doesn't seem to ring true with many people. But it is a platform. I will explain as we go on. Let me see. So it's a media component of the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, as we know, the Belt and Road Initiative has 5 components, right? It has policy coordination, facilities, connectivity, unimpeded trade, financial integration, and people-to-people bonds. Now, under the people-to-people bonds, you have the engagement that brings people to people. That is where the media engagement is located. So the Belt and Road is in the people-to-people exchange. And this was what was highlighted in President Xi Jinping's speech, that we develop a new people-to-people exchange platform, such as Belt and Road News Alliance and the Music Education Alliance. So the Belt and Road News Network is a kind of a conglomeration of media organizations. It's not just Africa; it's all over the world. You have a few of them in Europe. I think there's one from Mexico. I think so. But there's none from the US as well, as we would expect, But in Africa, you have plenty of them in Africa too. So what is it about? Well, it's, like I say, it's a partnership between China's state-led media organizations and more than 182 media organizations in 86 countries of the world. But as of December 2022, right? December 23rd, it has now increased to 201 countries. It has now increased to 203 media organizations from about 111 countries now. So there was an increment because since they held their last meeting in 2019 because of COVID, so they have not met again. Usually you go to China for meetings, and but they met virtually on the 23rd of December 2022. And during that meeting, they had more media organizations from around the world join the Belt and Road News Network. So it increased, I need to update this, right? It increased from 186 to 203 media organizations from 111 countries around the world. Now, but this is focused on Africa. But I'm just trying to give an overview of what the BR runs. So in Africa, there are 7, and this is focused on African media organizations on the council. You have a council. If you have, for instance, if you have a media organization or a media foundation, you have, trustees and all that. So this research is focused on media organizations on the council of the Belt and Road News Network. And you have 7 of them from Africa. You have the Al Aram newspaper in Egypt. You have Ethiopian News Agency. You have This Day in Nigeria. You have Independent Media South Africa. You have Alin Tibaha Daily Newspaper in Sudan. You have the Guardian Limited Tanzania, and you have Zambia Daily Mail in Zambia. So you will see it's a mix of both state media and private media organizations. So cuts across Africa, so to speak. These are media organizations on the council. So you have more media organizations who are just ordinary members, But I wouldn't focus on ordinary members, I'm focusing on the big guys, right? So, but this one is focused on 4 members on this council. That is This Day in Nigeria, Zambia Daily in Zambia, Independent Media in South Africa, and The Guardian in Tanzania. Yeah. So why am I studying this? Well, I'm looking at the success of the BRN, how it may influence maybe limited freedom in African media if we have a kind of export of Chinese media model into African media space. We know what that will result in. Why? You see, most times when we discuss export of Chinese media model into Africa, sometimes we could frown and say, but how possible? Well, because you see, the level of established democracy in Africa is very, very limited. Most African countries are transitional democracy, which means they are very, very susceptible to external influences. And China has a very strong impression on African political elites and economic elites. Why? Because you often hear that, well, if it has succeeded in China, then it could succeed in Africa. I remember when Nigeria shut down shut down Twitter. One of what our minister said, well, if China could, shut down Twitter and all that Western social media platform and still develop with 1 point something billion people, what Nigeria can do it. That was the justification. So you find a lot of justification for the export of Chinese media model into Africa. So well, if it's thriving in China, why not in Africa? With 2 billion, with 1 billion people, and China is developing, we should be able to do it. So I'm also looking at limited professional autonomy in reporting on Chinese activities. So if media organizations on the Belt and Road News Network, what level of agency do they have in reporting on activities that we could perceive, or the Chinese Communist Party could perceive as anti-China, anti-China events? How do they have the ability? Do they have the agency, the professional autonomy to report on those events? Then the possibility of replicating a Chinese media model on the African continent, and promotion of Chinese narrative of Uyghurs, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Tibet, which is these are critical issues, right? So I'm interested in how these critical issues are reported. Are they able to report these things in those spaces? So so we'll go. So my research question. So I'm looking at what is the dominant narrative of Uyghur Muslims, Taiwan and Hong Kong in these 4 media organizations, right? So I'm looking at, and one thing that the Chinese Communist Party could consider, anti-China narratives, anti-China, events. How is it reported in these media organizations? And what level of professional autonomy do African journalists, are they able to report on these, on these events that are perceived as anti-Chinese, right? So methodology, what did we do? So I did qualitative interviews with journalists across these 4 media organizations in these 4 different countries. In Nigeria, we interviewed 5 people from this newspaper. In Zambia, we interviewed 10 people. In Tanzania, 10. And in South Africa, we had 6 people across this team. Then I interviewed members of the governing council of the BRN from Nigeria and from Zambia. Then I also did content analysis of how these events are framed in this media organization. So totally, we interviewed about 33 journalists from the 4 media organizations. So now, as of the time I conducted this interview, the council is yet to meet as of the time. That was in 2020. That was before the last meeting on the 23rd of December, 2022. This governing council member from Nigeria was saying, well, that the Belt and Road News Network is a redundant body, or as far as I'm concerned. We last met since inauguration 2 years ago in Beijing, and since then, there have been no other meeting, not even virtually. But this was before December happened, last year. The Zambia said, well, we are supposed to meet once annually, but because of COVID, we only met once in 2019. So things are still evolving. With the lifting up of COVID restriction in China, things are getting back to normal, So one of the things that the journalists, tend to tell us is that, China-African relations is influencing how, they report on some of these activities. For instance, in South Africa, we know that South African-China relations is heavily economic, China is South Africa's biggest trading partner as of the moment. And South Africa is also part of the BRICS. So it becomes very, very difficult for journalists within this media space to report, anti-China activities in this media organization. But remember that this is just one media organization, right? So it might not be the same if you go to somewhere like M&G, for instance, Times, Business Day, it could be a different narrative. But also take into cognizance that a Chinese entity owns about 20%, equity in the independent media. So these are factors that we must also factor in to say, okay, well, but again, this is not just South Africa. I also saw this in Tanzania. So they say, well, we can't report on these activities because the government frowns on it. The government does not support it, and if the government frowns, then we will not be able to report on it because we go against the government, and that could result in anything in our media organizations, right? So then the media leadership does also not want to offend China. So they say, man, the editors, the owners of the media organization say, well, you can't, if you offend China, we'll be gone. It will affect our business. So we don't want to offend China. Don't report on these issues. So we know we don't have to report on these issues, right? Yeah. So again, I mean, the essay journalists, they pander to China in framing these stories. So when framing these kind of stories, these are so to speak, I call it anti-Chinese events, what do? They take these stories and they say, okay, they go back to the local Chinese embassy and say, well, this is what we have. What is your response? It is called inverse, pyramid reporting. Usually, the pyramid reporting it goes like this, right? But it is inverted, right? So if you take the report, you go to the person you're supposed to report against, and say, okay, this is what we have. What is your response, And the person says, well, no, this is not what is happening. I know what is happening. This is what is happening. Instead of you to report it from the other part, you report from the person's perspective and say, oh, this is not what is happening in China. Even though people tend to say, even though some other people from the West are saying this, but this is not what is happening in China. And this is what the embassy has just confirmed. So, so you have this. So media avoid stories that, this is in Tanzania, So, you have media is a business, and media owners don't want to get in conflict with government because nobody wants their businesses or their business to be shut down. If they are shut down, finances, revenue will be lost, and jobs will also be lost. So, I mean, they tend to say, okay, we don't want to have problem with the government. We don't want to get into the bad books of the Tanzanian government. And we must also acknowledge that before now, even though with the present government in Tanzania, we used to have the Tanzanian, what was it called? The former president was authoritarian, strictly authoritarian, even though he was a democratically elected president. I mean, but he has a heavy hand on the media, so people were cautious. Even the present president is also not very, very different because both of them also come from the same political party of the CCM, So, but I mean, one of the things we also found was limited knowledge about, these issues in African media. So even though the journalists know that it exists, they say, well, we know there's Uyghurs, issues around Uyghurs, issues around Taiwan, issues around Hong Kong, but we don't know much about it. Some of the journalists said so. But in the four countries, we found that Nigerian journalists are more likely to have limited knowledge of Uyghurs' persecution in China, or I mean, whatever you decide to call it. Why? Because I think because of the way Nigerian media is structured, right? It becomes difficult because people are more interested in what is happening maybe in Nigeria, right, than what is happening in China. So people are saying, "What's my business?" But let them, enjoy themselves. Let them, So we also see, like I've mentioned this, I said the vested interest in independent media. It's very, very critical when you consider how these issues are framed in independent media. Like a particular journalist was speaking here. He said, "Well, our media organization is very big on getting Chinese opinion pieces, but there's a Chinese vested interest in independent media. So you have some of these things happen within that space. I mean, if I own a 20% in a particular media organization, I will have some say, so you can't dismiss that, So conclusion and suggestions, well, it is like I mentioned earlier, it is important to bear in mind that the Belt and Road News Network is just one of many channels of Chinese influence operations in African media. And fortunately, my forthcoming book, which I tag "How China is Winning in African Media," has a kind of dwells on the diverse networks, through which China wins in the African media. And like Mariam highlighted, the Chinese media exchanges is also one of them. And there's so many other non-state approaches, to influences in the African media space. So thank you. Very brief. Okay.
Hi, can I take again a couple questions for Emeka from the in-person audience, and then again, if those in the Zoom audience, if you can hold your questions, we'll come back around to you. Maria.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I was curious if you have any information about the kind of obligations or what's really, what are these kind of units who are participating, those media outlets, what are they supposed to be doing as part of this BRNN? Do they have any obligations to publish certain stories? Do they get any money from being part of it? Like, what do they get out of this institution? And is it kind of influencing them directly, or what you described here in terms of all these basically forms of self-censorship, are those emerging as part of other mechanisms as well? And BRNN is kind of an extra pool. So I'm just trying to understand how BRNN is really working, I guess. Like, yeah, thank you.
They have certain objectives, and part of the objective is one, to report positively on the Belt and Road Initiative. Two, to support each other on expansion of new, it's called multi-digital journalism, that's new media. And the other one, they're as much as 10, there are more of them. So if you go on the BRN network, it has a platform, you find it there. So, but I'm just giving you a bit of them. But in terms of financial inducement, it's not written there. And unfortunately, the council members, nobody wants to, say more than that. They just tell you, well, the platform is to help us to help one another to establish media businesses, make sure that we consolidate. So what you see, it's a kind of the influences might not be direct. Nobody's going to come and tell you, oh, this is what you should do. But when you when you submit reports, it could get missing somewhere along the line. And nobody tells you what that happens. I mean, from my own experience as a former journalist, right? You could write a story and the editor says, oh, but that's a very good story. Oh, bring it. Oh, whoa. Keep it here. And they say, but what happened to my story? Say, we are still trying to see what we can do around it. So that is possible to happen. Especially in places like in Tanzania, it's very, very huge. I did a few work on this day in 2017, yes, yeah. And then what they told me was that, well, when we get stories, we go to the Chinese embassy, reporters. So we go say, okay, this is what has happened. Please, could you respond? Oh, the Chinese people say, oh, good, fine, bring it. They take it from them. We'll get back to you. And they don't get back to them. What do? They write a very beautiful press statement and send to the editors or the owners of those media organizations. And the editors say, okay, when the editor gets the press statement, he says, oh, reporter, come, have it, and go and report. And there's nothing you can do. The media is like a military business, The editors, your editor is like it's like the general, the GOC, and if he says go, you go. If he says come, you come. So, so that happens, yeah. So I think that indirect influences then.
Any other questions from the audience? Yeah, back here. And then to Laura.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Have you seen any pushback from civil society organizations or actors in the countries you visited to the BRNN and the influences and actions taken by Chinese actors?
You see, one of the things that I've just since I came to DC, and I've been trying to highlight even within policy circuit and all that, is that most people don't even know what is happening. Actually, most people don't know. So you go, who knows what is? I mean, how many people know what is BRN in the first place? Not even the journalists themselves, except for some of us who are observers of Chinese engagements within the media space in Africa. Not much people know what is happening. So one of the things I say, you need to train people. You need to create awareness so that people know what they are getting involved in, know the implications, but nobody knows. So the civil society themselves also, they don't even know what is happening. So I think that is even the biggest challenge within that space. Awareness. People don't know. Yeah.
Professor Smith.
No, thank you so much for your presentation. I learned a lot. And I was sort of curious methodologically and sort of conceptually how you chose those as the topics that you wanted to better understand. So why Uyghurs, why Hong Kong, and maybe not other topics that journalists might have chosen to write or not write about, how you came to choose those as opposed to other topics, and maybe what the implications of that are. Briefly, we can talk more later.
The narrative that I would consider anti, Chinese Communist Party, narrative that are not, what Chinese Communist Party would not like you to cover. And so I wanted to see if the journalists are able to cover these narratives, in that particular media, and if they cover it, what level of agency do they have in covering those kind of events, and the level of knowledge. So that was why I chose those. So they were like purposive. I chose them purposively. But I also looked at Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. That's also a very big issue, right? And I didn't find anything. And then in recent times, Ghana, I take Ghana for instance, but I couldn't find any media in Ghana that is on the Belt and Road News Network. But I know that the Xinhua has partnership agreement with both state media organizations and private media organizations in China. I also know there's engagement between the embassies and the journalists. And I know that many journalists have been taken from there to China to go on training, because we just wanted a work on Chinese media exchanges in Africa. In West Africa, we did in 4 countries of Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone, Liberia. Then in Africa as a whole, I did in another, one Ethiopia, Egypt, South Africa, Mozambique, Zimbabwe. So I just have this, because this forms part of my second book that is coming out, right? So one of the things that over time, when this illegal, I don't know if you have heard about illegal gold mining in Ghana. It is called Galamsey. And it's called Galamsey because it's artisanal gold mining. So it is reserved for the natives. So in 2012-13, when the Chinese, came to, got involved in it in Ghana, it was the media reported it as well. The Chinese were invading, that sector, taking over the local sector from the local people, and it led to a lot of uproar. Then Ghana was the first country in Africa to deport, Chinese people in 2013. Now, but over time, when the Chinese Chinese embassy, consciously, began to, engage with the media in Ghana directly. Over time, you have a different narrative now. Because, I conducted an interview in January 2022 with editors, in some of these media organizations where they have partnership with the local embassy. And, the narrative is now changed. The editors will tell you, well, even though the fuel is not good, but you don't have to blame the Chinese people. So you have to blame our own people. Because the Chinese people didn't know from where they came from that there was gold in that local place. It was the local people who took them to that place to go and mine the gold. So you don't have to blame. So you see a shift in narrative. So this thing happened out of, certain influences, engagement with the media. Yeah.
If I can take advantage of my position and ask one final question. I wanted to find out if in your study so far you've noticed any difference between public and private media organizations. And I asked that in particular in light of the South African case around coverage of the Dalai Lama in 2009, 2011, and in 2014, there were issues where the Dalai Lama was either denied a visa to come visit South Africa, or it was kind of put on the slow track. And so, Archbishop Desmond Tutu's birthday party happened before he could arrive in the country. And what was so interesting is, to me, having lived there through the first episode in 2009, was the different ways in which the different media outlets covered that story. So I'm wondering now with the different Chinese cases, if you're seeing a difference in both in terms of your study of this network, but just in media coverage in general on the continent. Do you see a distinct difference between private kind of media outlets and public state-owned government media outlets?
I'll give an example. In Kenya, for instance, when I looked at Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, you would see the Kenya Broadcasting Commission, which is state-owned, is very, very much pro China. Some of the journalists even wrote opinion pieces, attacking the U.S. government and Pelosi for visiting Taiwan, right? But even when you now go to the Daily Nation and the Standard, you see a bit of mixed, even though you see the narrative mixed here. So yes, the state media-owned organizations, because no matter what we do in the media space, we have to understand that there's a media system, and the media system is beholden to the political system. So the state media organizations are very, very positive about China because of the economic interest, and they don't want to offend the political elites, and you could lose your job. And when you lose your job, unfortunately, nobody can help you out. I mean, that is that. I don't know if I give this example in Nigeria during the COVID era. The state government produced a different kind of statement about the COVID, and a state-owned media now gave a different figure about the GM was sacked. He was leave of his job, so it goes down the same way. Once you go against the state, you are gone. So people are very, very cautious about that line. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. We were going to have a break afterwards, but yeah, let's go ahead and have a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back for the last presentation. Thanks, everyone.